Alright, so continuing with pathogens. Before people in the mid 1800s made the connection between disease and pathogens in sewage, epidemics were very common, especially things like cholera, typhoid fever, and prior to the 20th century they killed thousands of people just because sewage was just, it was just bad. Today, thankfully, we live in a time where public health officials and measures are made that prevent this disease cycle from happening. So, let's see. Waterborne diseases actually killed far more people than other types of diseases, and purifying water has saved more lives than modern medicine. So, 1. Purification and disinfection. Chlorine is typically the one agent that's used. Chlorine has residual effect. That means it kills germs up until and sometimes beyond the point that it comes out of your tap. And in very low concentrations, it's not toxic to people. And so chlorine is a good one. Collection and treatment of animal and human waste is another thing that has led to less disease being put in the water. So when wastes are processed and cleaned, obviously that's going to help. Sanitary standards for food processing, or where public food is prepared. So health inspectors come and they inspect restaurants and factories where food is processed, and they make sure that everything is being done within the law. If you have ever worked in the food industry, you are required to get your food handler's permit, where you learn about all the rules that you must follow to safely handle food so that it does not get contaminated and make people sick. And just basic hygiene stuff we've learned about. Basic hygiene, bathing, washing your hands, things like that. So, prior to the 20th century, a lot of people would just put perfume on and rarely bathe. In fact, Western Europeans did not really bathe, and it was kind of a racist thing, because the Jewish people have rituals of bathing and cleansing, and because they did not want to be involved with that, they felt that it was better to not bathe. And can you imagine the stench of body odor with perfume? Yeah, actually, I can imagine that because I have sophomore boys that come to my class after gym. A horrible smell. Don't do it, even if you're tempted. Okay. Let's see. Well, wait, before we move on to that. So, let's talk about, in modern times, the World Health Organization says that 1.1 billion people do not have access to safe drinking water. And 2.6 billion live in areas that have poor or no sewage collection or treatment facilities. There are between 2 and 5 million deaths every year traced to waterborne diseases, and it's mostly children under 5 that die of diarrhea and dysentery, which is really sad when it's for us, it's such a basic thing to have clean water. I can't remember if we've talked about the Millennium Development Goals yet, but if we haven't, we will get to those. This might be an intro to those, but one of the Millennium, or it's a review, I can't remember which, but one of the Millennium Development Goals addresses the health needs of having clean water. Okay, let's see. One thing that I would like to note that your book goes over, that populations in areas where there is little or no sewage treatment are extremely vulnerable to epidemics of diseases spread by sewage, especially cholera. In Peru, there was an outbreak of cholera in 1990 that killed several thousand people, and then it spread throughout Latin America. Sudan had a cholera outbreak in 2006 that spread to other parts of Africa. There were thousands of cases of people sick and more than 500 deaths. And the reason for this is because the normal treatment of water had been disrupted by the fighting in Sudan. Alright, let's move on to organic waste. Organic matter that creates serious problems if it enters bodies of water untreated is referred to as organic waste. So here we have examples: leaves, grass clippings, trash. All of those things can enter water as a consequence of runoff. And excessive aquatic plant growth can occur in the water. A lot of these wastes are biodegradable except for things like plastic and other human-made chemicals. When the bacteria feed off of those and decompose them, aerobic bacteria do that. They use up the oxygen. Let's take a minute to talk about dissolved oxygen. Dissolved oxygen is the water dissolved, or the oxygen dissolved in the water. Cold waters can hold more dissolved oxygen than warm waters can. That's why the fishing is typically better when the water is colder, in those areas of colder water. A moderate amount of organic matter decomposing in water can deplete water of its dissolved oxygen, because oxygen is typically in cold water. It can reach concentrations of 10 parts per million, but a lot less than that in warm water. So that's really not a lot of oxygen, 10 parts per million. And even just a slight outbreak of bacteria, aerobic bacteria breaking down organic matter, can deplete water in a very short time. So one of the things they do to test for organic waste is called the biochemical oxygen demand test. This measures how much organic material is in the water in terms of how much oxygen will be required to break it down biologically. The higher the BOD, the greater the likelihood that dissolved oxygen will be depleted. And a high BOD causes so much oxygen depletion that it really affects wildlife and harms especially fish and shellfish. They're vulnerable when dissolved oxygen drops below 2 to 3 parts per million. And a lot of species are even less tolerant than that. Raw sewage has a BOD value of 250 parts per million. Even 10 parts per million sewage can deplete water of its oxygen and produce bad consequences for pathogens that can be introduced in there. To monitor for that, this is called the fecal coliform test. Kind of sounds like a gross test, but what they do is they put a millipore filter disc in this filter apparatus. So this right here is that disc being placed in that filter apparatus, and then they draw water up through that filter. Any bacteria present are trapped on that disc right here, and then they put it in a petri dish with a special medium that supports growth of bacteria, and it turns the colonies of bacteria this kind of greenish color. the harmful ones. This is a particular color of fecal E. coli, so E. coli that grows in fecal matter. That way they can tell, at what level the coliform test is at. And they can tell you the relative risk of other pathogens. To be safe drinking water, they may not have any fecal coliform in a 100 milliliter sample. Water with as many as 200 E. coli is still considered safe for drinking, but above that they usually they may shut down a river or a beach and wait for that to clean out before they allow people to swim. Raw sewage that is usually only 99.9% water and rather only 0.1% waste has counts of, in the coliform test, of millions. So even though a raw sewage concentration might be very small, it can have millions of harmful pathogens in it. Okay, chemical pollutants. Water is a solvent. We've talked about this before. Water is polar, so it dissolves compounds, and other polar molecules dissolve in it very well. Water is called the universal solvent a lot of times. A lot of inorganic chemicals are water soluble, and a lot of these are toxic, like heavy metals, lead and mercury, arsenic, nickel. Some form acids, like sulfuric acid from mine drainings, or nitric acid. Salts that they use to melt the snow, called sodium and calcium chlorides, are harmful. Organic chemicals are a whole nother class of those, so like oil, petroleum products, from spills or from parking lots, runoff from parking lots, spraying of farms with pesticides and herbicides, cleaning solvents, detergents. There's a whole list. A lot of these pollutants are toxic even at low concentrations, and we'll get into that when we get into our hazardous wastes chapter in the next unit. And then they biomagnify in the tissues of organisms. This picture right here is an example of acid mine drainage. In this one, this is a coal mine. It's near a coal mine, and the stream bottoms are coated with orange deposits of iron. That iron leaches out because the water is so acidic that it causes the iron to leach out, and then only really high acid tolerant algae are able to grow there. Not algae, but it's so late. Archaea. They have high concentrations of sulfide and iron, and they oxidize when they come out into the open. So they produce basically sterile streams, except for those microorganisms, those archaea that can live in there. Another consequence of water pollution is sedimentation. In streams, sediments will have, small fish will have a loss of habitat. Plants that are attached to rocks get scoured out, and then there's poor light penetration. And when we come back in part 3, I'm going to show you a diagram of this.